Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the strange case of Frank Steele and the murder of Nana Barrett, which took place in Gateshead in 1915. I must add that some accounts give her name as Nina, but Nana is the more popular version and it is also used in the census and the death records. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe, it doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information about the past life of either of those involved in this week's case, so the backstory will be quite basic. Frank Steele was around 31 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1884. His place of birth is unknown, and it is not clear if his father had died, but his mother had remarried. He worked as a labourer, however his place of work is unknown, but it is possible he had at some time worked at Armstrong's. Frank seems to have been known as quite a heavy drinker and had previously been arrested 4 times for drunkenness and also for assaulting a police officer. Frank had been married in 1913, his wife's name is not known, but she had been found dead in June of 1914, and the inquest at the time had reached the verdict that she had taken her own life. Nana Barrett, who sometimes used the surname Spurs, was around 21 years old at the time of her death. She was born in Newcastle in around 1894 to parents James and Louisa, and was one of at least 5 children. She had left home in around 1911 and had a child, possibly with a man by the name of Joseph Bell. However, the child, it is not known if it was male or female, had recently died, and this had upset Nana a great deal. Around 3 months before her death, she had been living in Nelson Street in Gateshead with Frank Steele. On May the 16th, Elizabeth Gray, who lived next door to Frank Steele and Nana Barrett in Gateshead, heard the sound of the couple talking in their room. No other sounds were heard from them after this. The following morning, Elizabeth shouted to them that the rent man was coming, and Frank thanked her for letting him know. A short time after this, she heard Frank go out. She noticed that the blinds to their rooms were closed, and although she thought it was a little strange, she assumed that Nana had gone to visit her mother, and the landlord had also not been able to get an answer at their door. Frank went to visit his mother in Newcastle on the 17th, but he was so drunk that she did not want to speak to him. He returned the following night and was still very much the worse for drink. He told his mother, "I have done it, I have killed her." His mother told him he should go to the police and confess his crime, but he began to talk to her about something else, so she told him she would fetch a policeman, and he told her to do so. When P.C. Ray arrived, he asked Frank what this tale was all about, and Frank told him, "I have killed her, I have cut her throat. Here is the key, go to Nelson Street in Gateshead, and you will find her." P.C. Ray took Frank to the police station, where he continued to say that he had killed Nana. A message was then sent to Gateshead Police Station, and Sergeant Forsyth and P.C. Cairns went to the house. They found the door was locked and the blinds were closed. They forced the door open, and on entering they found Nana lying on a bed in a pool of blood. Her throat had been cut, and she had clearly been dead for some time. A doctor was sent for, and Sergeant Forsyth went to Gateshead to arrest Frank Steele for the willful murder of Nana Barrett. The inquest was held at Gateshead Police Courts on May the 28th before Coroner Shepherd. Louisa Barrett said she had identified the body as being that of her daughter Nana, who was 21 years old. She said her daughter had left and returned home several times over the past 4 years. She said that 2 years ago she had been in the workhouse, and when she had left there she had been lodging in Pilgrim Street. Louisa said at the time that she was in Pilgrim Street she had a child living with her and was aware that money was paid for the child's keep by the father. She said she did not know how her daughter had earned a living while she had not been living at home. She said her daughter came to her home around August of 1914 and told her that her child had died, and later she found out that Nana was living in Nelson Street in Gateshead with Frank Steele. She said Nana told her that they were married. She said she had seen Nana with a man in a public house, and Nana had told her this man was her husband, and Louisa said when she met him he was very drunk. She said she did visit Nana occasionally and had gone to the house on the 17th and got no reply. She had later been told that her daughter was dead and had gone to the dead house where she had seen her body. She said she had later seen several men at the police station and had identified Frank as being the man Nana had said she was married to. Elizabeth Gray said she lived in Nelson Street in Gateshead. She said in August of 1914 Nana had come to lodge with her. She said at the time she had a child with her, but the child had died 2 weeks later. Elizabeth said she did not think that Nana had a job, but she believed that she worked on the streets. She said a short while after the child died, Nana moved in the rooms of the house next door. She lived there alone at first, but about 3 months before the crime, Frank Steele had moved in with her. She said she did not believe that Nana had worked the streets after Frank had moved in. She had never seen Nana the worse for drink. She said she believed that Frank was usually a hard-working man, but that he did take to the drink almost every weekend. She said on May the 16th she heard the couple talking in their rooms. She did not suggest that this was an argument. She said she had heard them at around 3 p.m. and did not hear any more from them that day. The following morning she had shouted out to let Frank know that the rent man was on his way, and she said Frank had shouted back to thank her. At around 11 a.m. she believed she had seen Frank leave the rooms and head up the street. He looked sober to her at the time, and she did not see him again after this. She noticed that the blinds to the couple's room were closed all day, and although this seemed strange, she just assumed that Nana had gone to visit her mother. She said the rent man had knocked and had been unable to get an answer. Mary Murphy said she also lived in Nelson Street in Gateshead. She said Nana had told her that the child's father was a man by the name of Joseph Bell. She said she had found Nana in the street 3 or 4 weeks ago, crying, and she said she told her that she had sent a letter to Joseph Bell, but it had been returned. And she said that Nana had also told her that she was not married to Frank. Mary said she had later seen Frank reading the letter, and he had asked her what she thought of it, and she had told him it was best forgotten. She said after this, Nana had come to her house upset several times, saying that Frank had been upset by the letter and that he kept bringing it up and upsetting her as well. William Johnson said on May the 16th he had met Frank at Bottlebank in Gateshead. He said he was terribly drunk and he had told him, "I have done Nana in." He said he had a mark on his neck and he had told him that someone had tried to stab him. Elizabeth Frost of Newcastle said Frank was her son from a former marriage. She said he had told her that he was living with a woman in Gateshead, and on the 17th of May he had come to her house. She said he was very bad with the drink, and so she went upstairs out of his way. She said he returned the following night, and he was just as bad with the drink then, and he had told her, "I have done it, I have killed her." She said that she told him, "If you have done such a crime as that, why don't you give yourself up like a man?" She said he then began to talk to her about his neck, but she did not want to listen to him, and she said she told him she could not live with him upsetting her so, and if he would not go to the police, she would fetch a policeman herself, and he had told her, "Get one, mother." She said she sent for a policeman, and when they arrived they took her son away. P.C. Ray said he had been called to the house in Newcastle on the 18th around 9:30 p.m. he found Frank casually sitting in the house smoking a cigarette. He asked him, "What is this you have been doing at Gateshead?" And he said Frank replied, "I have cut her throat. Here is the key. If you go to 31 Nelson Street, you will find her lying on the bed. I will swing for this at Durham Prison." PC Ray said he then took him to the police station at Newcastle and sent word to Gateshead Police Station for them to check the address. He said Frank continued to repeat that he had done it. On arriving at the police station, he had searched Frank and found a razor and a bottle of rum in his possession. Sergeant Forsyth said, acting on information received, he had gone to the house in Gateshead with PC Cairns. They had found the outer door locked, but they had broken it open. They found a woman lying on the bed with pillows over her face, and when they removed those, they found that her throat had been cut and that she was lying in a pool of blood. She had been dead for some days and nothing could be done for her, but, he said, a doctor still had to be sent for. In the room, he said he also found a man's shirt that had bloodstains on it and the remains of a meal on the table, and all around the room he found empty beer bottles, and there were 2 glasses on the table. He said that he then went to Newcastle Police Station with PC Cairns, and here they saw Frank Steele. He was very drunk at the time, and he also noted that he had been found with a razor in his possession. He said when he charged him with the murder of Nana Barrett, Frank replied, "I don't care. I cut her throat with that razor on Sunday. She came in drunk. I done it. I then cut my own throat and cut my arm. I went to bed in the house and slept all night. The next day I went to Sunderland and South Shields and have been to other places since, and I intended to finish myself tonight." Sergeant Forsyth said Frank sent for him a couple of days, asking him to go to the post office and ask for a copy of the letter that Nana had sent to Joseph Bell that had been returned. He said Frank told him he had seen some of it and said that she had told Joseph that she had fallen wrong to him and she wanted him to visit her while he, Frank, was on night shift. Sergeant Forsyth said he had made inquiries at the post office, but they had told him that they did not keep copies of returned mail. Dr. Robinson said he had been called to the house in Nelson Street by Sergeant Forsyth. He said it was clear that Nana was already dead and had been so for several days. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Nana Barrett, and it was his professional opinion that she had died due to blood loss from the 5-inch wound to her neck. He said she also had several bruises about her body, and he did not believe that the wound on her neck had been self-inflicted. I did not find any details of the coroner's statement to the jury, and the jury retired for only a short time before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder against Frank Steele, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Nana Barrett, but I do know that she was buried in Gateshead Cemetery, and evidence suggests that she is buried in the same grave as her parents, but there is no mention of the child that she had that died. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Nana anywhere in the cemetery. The trial took place on July the 6th, 1915 at Durham before Mr. Justice Ridley. Frank replied not guilty in a firm voice in answer to the charge of murder. As is often the case, the majority of the evidence at the trial is the same as at the inquest, so I will only include the new information. And in this case, no new witnesses were called, and the only new information comes from the defence, the prosecution, and the judge. It was noted in the opening statement that the letter which had been spoken about at the inquest contained information that suggested that Nana was pregnant and that the father was Joseph Bell, and that this had led Frank to become quite jealous, especially when he had read part of the letter where Nana had been asking Joseph to visit her at the home that he, Frank, shared with her. The prosecution said it was clear to him that Frank had not only been aware of what he had done, but was also aware that he had done it, and this was not a case of him being drunk and unaware of his actions. Drink may have made him more angry, but it had not made him oblivious to the crime he was committing when he had attacked Nana Barrett. And he said that he had also told many people what he had done, which made it clear that he knew, drunk or not, that what he had done was wrong. The defence, in complete disagreement with the prosecution, said that Frank was blind drunk. He had been drinking all day before the crime was committed, and he did not know what he was doing. He had no way of knowing right from wrong at the time that he attacked Nana. And he added that the suggestion that this was a crime of passion because of jealousy did not make sense, as surely Frank would have been mad with jealousy at the time he first read the letter that was alleged to have upset him some 2 weeks before the murder, and yet he had made no attempt to attack Nana then. He said that this was a case of acting in madness when under the influence of drink, and he urged the jury to find Frank Steele guilty of manslaughter. The judge, in summing up, said it was for the jury to decide if they believed that Frank had been too drunk to know what he was doing, and that he was also not aware that using a razor would cause her to lose her life. And if they believed this, then they were entitled to find him guilty of manslaughter. The jury retired for around an hour and a half, but still had not reached a verdict, so the judge called them back in to inquire what the issue was. The foreman asked him to explain again what the law was with regard to alcohol, and the judge reminded them that the law stated drunkenness was no excuse for crime, but in the case of a man charged with murder, if the jury felt that he was too drunk to be aware of his actions, then they could reduce the crime to one of manslaughter. The jury again retired, but this time for only 5 minutes, before returning with a verdict of guilty of willful murder. When Frank was asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed, he replied, "Yes, I have not had a fair trial." The judge, then wearing the black cap, addressed Frank Steele, telling him, "You have stated that you have not had a fair trial, but in my opinion you have had a very fair trial. You must now make your peace with God for the sin you have committed." He then sentenced Frank to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. Frank was then removed from the dock and returned to the prison. Almost immediately, Frank asked to appeal his sentence, and while this was being discussed, no date was set for the execution. He was allowed to attend an appeal hearing and travelled to London at the end of July for this, and it was stated here that the original trial had been just and fair. There was no evidence to support the idea that Frank had not known what he was doing because of drink, and the application to appeal was dismissed, and Frank was returned to Durham for his execution. And it was said that no one in the area seemed to feel a great deal of interest in the case, and therefore no petitions were set up for a reprieve, and the Home Secretary stated that there was no plan to commute the sentence, so the execution would go ahead. During his time in prison, Frank was visited often by friends and family, and he was also attended by the Reverend Jacob, and he was said to be a very well-behaved prisoner. The execution took place on August the 11th, 1915, and the night before it was said that Frank did not sleep very well. He was awake at 6 a.m, and he then dressed himself in the same suit that he had worn for his trial. The executioner was John Ellis, who had arrived in Durham the previous night with his assistant, and this would be a private execution with no press in attendance. A little before 8 a.m, Frank was pinioned, which means that his arms were tied at the wrist, and in this case they were tied behind his back, and he was then led to the scaffold. And it was said that Frank walked firmly to the scaffold. And once on the drop, John Ellis placed the rope around his neck, covered his head with the white cap, and then stepping off the drop, gave the signal, and the bolt was removed, and Frank fell. Death was said to be instantaneous. Unlike in previous years, no black flag was flown and no bell was rang to let anyone know outside that the sentence had been carried out. In this case, a notice was posted outside the prison that simply stated that the prison surgeon had examined the body of Frank Steele and confirmed that he was dead. After the usual time of 1 hour, the body was removed and placed in a plain coffin. An inquest was held, which was the normal procedure, and afterwards Frank was buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. No markers were placed, and only the prison records would show where his body lay. I just want to add here that every newspaper article that I looked at simply stated that Nana had a child. No one said whether this child was male or female, and no one seemed to offer any explanation for the child's death. Now, I did find it very sad that even her own mother did not seem to give the child the dignity of a name, or even to say if it was a boy or a girl. And it's also worth noting that the doctor did not mention that Nana had been pregnant at the time of her death, which would have surely been mentioned when he spoke of the post-mortem. This was a very odd story. It would seem that the only motive anyone could find was the idea that Nana may have been pregnant again by her previous lover, Joseph Bell, and that this had made Frank insanely jealous. Despite the defence suggesting he had not acted when he first read the letter about this, it still seems to be the only real reason that anyone could come up with as to why Frank had taken her life. And it's true to say that people do not always act immediately, sometimes taking days, weeks, or even months to react to something that has upset them. And it also surely has to make most of us wonder if his first wife had really taken her own life, or had Frank also been involved in that somehow, and been lucky enough not to be caught. Nana sadly does not seem to have led a very good life after leaving home. She perhaps saw Frank as a means of support once she realised she was pregnant again, if indeed she was. But she does not seem to have wanted to be with him. She wanted to be with Joseph. And sadly, it does seem that the letter that she wrote to him ended up being the cause of her death. And she had also told her mother that she was married to Frank, but at no time at all did he confirm this. And perhaps this was because her mother knew she was pregnant and Nana wanted her to think that the baby was Frank's. But regardless of her lifestyle or the lies that she told, she did not deserve to die at just 21 years old, killed by a man that she barely knew. Were the jury right to find Frank guilty of murder? Well, yes, I think they were. I think it was clear that, drunk or not, he knew what he had done. He had told many people that he had killed her. And the jury could not have said that he had been unaware of what he was doing because of this. And I also think that it was correct that he was hanged for his crime. But what do you think? Do you think it was possible that Frank had been more involved in the death of his first wife? Do you think he killed Nana because he was jealous of her affair with Joseph Bell? Do you think that he knew exactly what he was doing when he cut her throat, or do you think it was possible that he was too drunk to be aware of what he was doing? And do you think the jury came to the correct decision with a guilty of willful murder verdict? And also, do you think it was correct that he was hanged for his crime? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.